The neon pulse of the onyx felt like a heartbeat that was no longer her own. Naomi Carter stood at the edge of the VIP lounge, her vibrant red silk dress shimmering under the strobe lights, but her eyes were fixed on the exit. For 3 years, she had been a satellite orbiting the volatile gravity of Darius Kane, and tonight, the air between them had finally turned lethal. "You think you can just embarrass me and stay for the next song?" The words were a low growl, vibrating against the back of her neck. Naomi felt the heat of Darius's breath before his hand clamped around her bicep. His fingers, thick and calloused, dug into her skin with a possessive strength that made her breath hitch. "Darius, stop. Everyone is looking," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the heavy bass. "Let them look," he snarled. He jerked her toward him, his jaw flexed in a mask of unhinged aggression. "You've belonged to me for 3 years, Naomi. Don't start acting like a stranger now." He didn't wait for an answer. With a brutal yank, he spun her around, her heels skidding across the polished glass floor. Naomi's torso twisted as she fought against the momentum, her muscles straining, but Darius was a force of nature fueled by a hair-trigger temper. He dragged her toward the heavy velvet curtains of the exit, his posture dominating the space behind her. Naomi looked desperately at the faces around them. A group of women in sequins turned away to adjust their makeup in a mirror. A bartender meticulously polished a glass, his eyes fixed on the shelf behind him. In a room filled with 100 witnesses, Naomi was invisible. 3 years. She had spent 1,000 days walking on eggshells and barricading doors in her mind, only to realize that in the middle of a crowd, she was still alone in her cage. Darius's frustration boiled over. He reached up, his fist tangling into her loose, voluminous spirals. He jerked her head back with such force that a sharp cry escaped her lips. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Naomi's head was tilted toward the ceiling, her vision blurring with tears, but as she gasped for air, her gaze snagged on a figure at the far end of the bar. Kang Minyi sat perfectly still. He was a pillar of controlled power amidst the club's frantic energy, his dark suit tailored to a frame that suggested readiness without panic. The strobe light caught the intricate ink of a dragon's tail creeping up the side of his neck, disappearing under a jawline that looked carved from stone. He wasn't filming. He wasn't whispering to a companion. He was simply watching, his calculating gaze fixed on the hand Darius had buried in Naomi's hair. Slowly, with a rhythmic, terrifying calm, Minyi set his crystal glass down on the marble counter. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply stood up, his shoulders squaring as he unbuttoned the top button of his jacket. As he began to walk toward them, the air in the lounge seemed to thin. Darius was still screaming, still pulling, oblivious to the fact that the bully was about to meet a god. Naomi spent 1,095 days praying for a savior while the world watched her drown in silence. If you were one of the 100 people in that club watching her hair being ripped out, would you have looked away too, or are you brave enough to stand up like Minyi? Be honest, tell me in the comments. Before we proceed, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here. Now let's dive into the story. The cold didn't start with a blow. It started with a coat. 3 years ago, Naomi had admired the way Darius Kane walked into a room, his confidence acting like a gravitational pull that she was all too eager to fall into. On their first date, when she shivered in the autumn breeze, he had draped his jacket over her shoulders with a smile that felt like a promise of eternal warmth. She hadn't realized then that the jacket was a shroud, and the warmth was a fever that would eventually consume her life. The first year was a season of accidents. It was the sound of a wine glass shattering against the kitchen tiles because she had stayed 20 minutes late at work. It was the smell of burnt sage as he paced the apartment, claiming he only lost his temper because he loved her too much. The violence was always followed by the thaw, a sensory overload of expensive roses that filled the room with a suffocating sweetness and the salt-heavy taste of his tears as he knelt at her feet. He would press his forehead against her knees, his voice a broken whisper, promising that he would change, that he was just a man haunted by his own devotion. By the second year, the winter had deepened, turning into a permanent frost. The sensory details of her life became a map of survival. She learned the specific, heavy thud of his boots on the stairs, a sound that dictated whether she should keep cooking dinner or hide in the bathroom. She learned the metallic scent of his cologne when he had been drinking, a sharp, biting aroma that signaled the coming storm. The cycle became a rhythmic, terrifying machine. The accusation, the grip on her jaw that left the faint, ghost-like shadow of his thumb on her skin, and the inevitable apology. The apologies were the most dangerous part. Darius would wrap his arms around her, his muscular build making her feel small and fragile, and he would tell her that the world was a cruel place, that he was the only one who truly understood her. He systematically dismantled her connections, turning the sound of her ringing phone into a source of panic until she finally stopped answering altogether. He replaced her friends with his presence, her ambitions with his demands, and her voice with his roars. The third year was when the sensory world narrowed to the point of suffocation. Naomi lived in a landscape of muted colors and hushed tones. She stopped wearing the bright red dresses she loved, opting for high collars to hide the finger-shaped bruises on her neck. She learned to sleep with one ear open, tracking the rhythm of his breathing, waiting for the slight shift in his covers that meant he was waking up in a mood to dominate. The violence was no longer a surprise. It was the climate of her existence. There was a specific night, 6 months before the club, that remained burned into her mind like a brand. The house had been silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator, when a minor comment about a grocery receipt sent him into a silent, vibrating rage. He hadn't screamed that night. He had simply walked over and placed his hand over her mouth, his eyes wide and vacant. The taste of his palm, salty, dry, and smelling of leather, was all she could perceive as he held her against the wall, his weight crushing the air from her lungs. In that moment of absolute stillness, Naomi realized that there was no more warmth left to find in him. The man who had once offered her his coat had become the frost that was killing her. Every "I'm sorry" that followed felt like ice water in her veins. She began to see the roses not as gifts, but as funeral flowers for the woman she used to be. She moved through the world like a ghost, her spirit retreating into a small, barricaded corner of her mind where she kept the only thing he couldn't touch, the memory of her own strength. By the time they walked into the Onyx, Naomi was a master of the mask. She wore the red dress not out of joy, but as a final act of quiet rebellion, a flash of color in a world he had turned gray. She knew the misunderstanding at the bar was coming before it even happened. She could feel the air pressure change, the familiar sensory shift that preceded a strike. But as Darius's hand clamped onto her arm, dragging her back into the winter she had lived in for 3 years, she didn't know that the season was finally about to change. She didn't know that across the room, a man who moved with the silence of a coming thaw was already reaching for the buttons of his jacket. The bass of the Onyx was a physical weight, a rhythmic thumping that vibrated in Naomi's chest, but it couldn't drown out the sudden, sharp change in the air beside her. It started with a look, a fleeting, innocent glance Naomi had cast toward the bartender to order a second mineral water. But in the distorted reality of Darius's mind, that glance was a betrayal. He didn't see a thirsty woman. He saw a disloyal possession searching for an exit. "Who were you looking at?" Darius's voice was a low, jagged blade that cut through the upbeat tempo of the house music. Naomi didn't even have time to answer. The misunderstanding was a flash fire, fueled by the 3 years of volatile history they carried. Darius's hand moved with the speed of a strike, his fingers locking onto her forearm. He didn't just pull her, he anchored her to the spot. His knuckles whitening as he leaned in close enough for her to smell the sharp, metallic tang of the gin on his breath. "I was just getting water, Darius. Please," she whispered, her eyes darting around the lounge. "You're a liar," he hissed, his face contorting into the mask she had learned to fear in the dark of their apartment. "You think you're so clever in that dress, don't you? You think you can find someone better in a place like this?" He jerked her arm, sending her stumbling into the edge of a glass-topped table. The clatter of falling crystal was loud, a sharp punctuation mark in the music, but the reaction from the crowd was a chilling void. A group of men in tailored blazers shifted their stools just a few inches away to avoid the commotion. A woman in a sequined cocktail dress looked at Naomi's wide, terrified eyes, then primly adjusted her own necklace and turned back to her conversation. The indifference was a second assault. It was the social silence that Darius thrived on. He knew that as long as he looked like a boyfriend, handling a difficult girl, the world would let him finish what he started. "We're leaving. Now!" Darius roared, his voice finally breaking into a shout that drew every eye in the VIP section. He didn't lead her. He began to drag her. Naomi dug her heels into the polished floor, her muscles straining against his overwhelming strength. "Darius, you're hurting me. Stop." Her plea was met with a chorus of turned heads. A young couple at a nearby booth whispered to each other, the girl shaking her head as if Naomi was the one causing the scene. The bartender, who had seen her order water just moments ago, suddenly became very busy checking the inventory under the counter. The club patrons were an audience of ghosts, watching a tragedy unfold through the safety of their champagne flutes. The lack of intervention emboldened Darius. He felt the power of the room's apathy. He twisted his grip, sliding his hand from her wrist to the back of her head. When his fingers tangled into her curls, Naomi let out a sharp, jagged scream that should have stopped the music. It didn't. The beat moved on, indifferent to the fact that her scalp felt like it was being torn away. "You want to make a scene? I'll give you a scene," Darius shouted, his face inches from hers, his eyes blown wide with the thrill of dominance. He began to pull her backward, forcing her spine to arch at a painful angle as he dragged her across the center of the lounge. Naomi's hands clawed at his wrist, her red silk dress twisting and straining against her body. She looked at the faces passing by, the shock, the mild curiosity, the blatant hesitation, and realized that none of them were coming. She was in a room of 100 people, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Then her gaze hit the far end of the bar. Amidst the sea of moving bodies and flashing lights, one man was perfectly still. Kang Minyi hadn't looked away. He wasn't whispering or checking a phone. He was leaning back, his dark suit blending into the shadows, his eyes fixed with a surgical, calculating focus on Darius's fist. As Darius jerked Naomi again, causing her to stumble to her knees, Minyi slowly set his glass down. The sound was lost to the room, but the intent was visible in the way his shoulders squared. The bystanders had chosen silence, but as the man with the dragon tattoo began his steady, unhurried walk toward the center of the chaos, Naomi realized that the silence was about to be broken by a power far greater than Darius's rage. The scream Naomi let out was raw, a sound that should have shattered the glass in every hand at the onyx, but it only seemed to fuel Darius's delusion of control. He twisted his fist deeper into her curls, his face flushed with a terrifying, triumphant heat. He felt invincible in his rage, bolstered by the cowardice of the crowd. He didn't hear the music dip as the DJ's hand faltered, and he didn't notice the sudden, heavy silence that began to ripple out from the bar. He didn't notice until the air around them turned freezing. Darius was mid-shout, his mouth open to deliver another jagged insult, when a hand, cool, steady, and immovable, clamped onto his wrist. It wasn't a strike, it was a reclamation. The grip was so precise, so anatomically perfect in its pressure, that Darius's fingers involuntarily spasmed, releasing Naomi's hair. "I believe the lady made her position clear," a voice said. It was a low, melodic rasp that carried further than Darius's screaming ever could. Darius spun around, his other fist cocked back, ready to swing at whoever dared to interrupt his private matter. But the punch died in his throat. He found himself looking up, not because of height, but because of the sheer, crushing weight of the presence standing before him. Kang Minyi didn't look like a man in a fight. He looked like a man deciding whether to crush an insect beneath his heel. His dark suit was still perfectly pressed, his white shirt unblemished, and his eyes were as flat and uncaring as the surface of a frozen lake. The dragon's tail tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse in the strobe light, a silent warning of the fire that lay beneath the ice. "Who the hell are you?" Darius spat, though his voice lacked its previous iron. He tried to yank his arm back, but Minyi's hand didn't move an inch. It was like being tethered to a mountain. "Someone who doesn't like noise," Minyi replied. He stepped closer, entering Darius's personal space with a slow, predatory grace. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look angry. He simply increased the pressure on Darius's wrist. The sound of small bones shifting made Naomi flinch. Darius let out a wheezing gasp, his knees buckling. He looked around for the bravado he'd felt moments ago, but he found none. The crowd that had been indifferent to Naomi's pain was now captivated by his humiliation. They weren't looking at a boyfriend, handling his girl anymore. They were looking at a small, loud man being dismantled by a god. "You're hurting me," Darius whined, the bully's mask finally slipping to reveal the coward beneath. "Pain is a teacher," Minyi murmured, leaning in so only Darius and the trembling Naomi could hear him. And today the lesson is simple. You will never touch her again. You will not speak her name. You will not even think of her. Because if you do, I will find you. And I am much less patient than she is. With a flick of his wrist that looked effortless, Minyi sent Darius stumbling backward. The muscular antagonist tripped over his own feet, falling into the same glass-topped table he had forced Naomi against earlier. He lay there, gasping, looking up at the man with the dragon tattoo with a wide-eyed terror that Naomi had once seen in her own mirror. Minyi didn't spare him another glance. He turned to Naomi. The lethal intensity in his eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted, becoming a protective shield rather than a weapon. He looked at the red silk of her dress, torn at the shoulder, and the raw skin of her arm where Darius's thumb had dug in. He didn't ask if she was okay. He could see she wasn't. Instead, he reached into the front of his jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate, and so heavy with potential violence that the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Darius flinched, shielding his face, expecting a weapon. Instead, Minyi withdrew a crisp, white silk handkerchief. He held it out to her, his posture steady and grounding. "The exit is this way, Naomi," he said, using her name as if it were a sacred fact. "And I promise you, no one in this room or any other will stop you from walking through it." Naomi reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the silk. The contact was electric, a spark of warmth that finally began to melt the 3-year winter in her bones. She looked at the bystanders, then at the broken man on the floor, and finally at the Mafia boss who had stood up when the world stayed seated. As Minyi placed a hand lightly on the small of her back, a gesture of guidance, not possession, Naomi took her first step toward a new world. The music at the Onyx finally stopped, but for the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a beginning. The transition from the neon-soaked violence of the club to the interior of Minyi's obsidian-black sedan was a blur of velvet and silence. Naomi sat stiffly in the back seat, the silk handkerchief he had given her still pressed against the raw skin of her arm. Beside her, Kang Minyi was a statue of tailored darkness, his gaze fixed on the rain-slicked streets of the city. He didn't speak, and for the first time in 3 years, Naomi didn't feel the frantic need to fill the silence with apologies or explanations. The silence wasn't a fuse, it was a shield. When the car finally pulled into the private subterranean garage, of a glass and steel needle piercing the clouds. The air felt different, thinner, colder, and utterly secure. Minyi led her to a private elevator that required a biometric scan. As the doors hissed shut, Naomi caught her reflection in the polished chrome. Her red dress was torn, her hair was a chaotic nest where Darius's fingers had been, and her eyes were wide with a residual terror. But standing behind her, Minyi looked like a shadow that had finally found its owner. The penthouse was a gilded fortress. It was a sprawling expanse of white marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, and minimalist perfection. There were no soft corners, no clutter, nothing that could be thrown, nothing that could be hidden behind. It was a cathedral of absolute control. "This is your home for as long as you require it," Minyi said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the floor. He gestured toward a hallway illuminated by soft, recessed lighting. "Your suite is at the end. My staff has already prepared it with what you might need. No one enters this floor without my personal authorization. Not the staff, not my captains, and certainly not the man you left behind." Naomi walked toward the room, her footsteps swallowed by the thick, cream-colored rug. When she pushed open the heavy oak door, she stopped. The suite was larger than the entire apartment she had shared with Darius. A king-sized bed was draped in charcoal silk, and a fireplace crackled softly in the corner, chasing away the chill that had lived in her marrow for 3 years. She turned to see Minyi standing in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. The tattoos on his neck seemed to glow in the dim light. "The door locks from the inside, Naomi," he said, his voice dropping to a rasp. "But you should know, I have guards at the elevators and sensors on the glass. Even if the world ends tonight, it will not cross that threshold." He retreated into the shadows of the hallway, the soft click of his footsteps fading until the penthouse was silent. Naomi stood in the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She moved toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. For 3 years, the ritual of the night had been the same. checking the window locks, dragging the heavy kitchen chair to wedge under the front door handle, and lying awake to listen for the specific, heavy thud of Darius's boots. She touched the lock. It was a simple, elegant deadbolt. She turned it. Click. She waited. She waited for the sound of a fist against the wood. She waited for the roar of a man demanding entrance. She waited for the familiar spike of adrenaline that preceded a blow. Nothing happened. The silence remained unbroken. Naomi leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door and let out a sob that had been trapped in her chest since the first autumn jacket had been draped over her shoulders. She didn't have to drag a chair. She didn't have to check the windows. For the first time in 1,095 days, the lock on the door was enough. She moved to the bed, the silk cool against her skin as she crawled under the covers. She watched the shadows of the fire dance on the ceiling, her mind drifting to the man with the dragon tattoo sitting somewhere in the dark of the living room. He was a monster to the rest of the world, a man who dealt in blood and shadows, but to her, he was the only wall that hadn't crumbled. As sleep finally pulled her under, Naomi realized that she wasn't just behind a door. She was behind a king. And for the first time in 3 years, the winter was finally, mercifully over. The first few weeks in the gilded fortress were a lesson in the architecture of respect. Naomi woke every morning expecting the air to be thick with the familiar metallic tang of tension, but she found only the quiet, sun-drenched stillness of the penthouse. There were no demands, no sharp voices echoing through the halls, and most importantly, there was no fear. Kang Minyi was a man of few words, but his actions were a systematic dismantling of the walls Darius had built around her soul. He began to rebuild her not through force, but through a terrifyingly soft reverence that Naomi found harder to navigate than his coldness. He didn't just give her safety, he gave her back her agency, one small, deliberate choice at a time. It started with the simple act of a meal. Instead of the frantic, hurried dinners she had cooked for Darius, always terrified the salt was too much or the heat too low, Minyi invited her to sit at the head of a table carved from a single piece of dark walnut. He didn't order for her. He placed a menu in front of her and waited. "I don't mind what we eat," Naomi whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the silk napkin. "I do," Minyi replied, his gaze steady. The light from the chandelier caught the dragon's tail on his neck, making the ink look like it was moving. "I care about what you want, Naomi. In this house, your desire is the only directive that matters." When she finally chose, he didn't criticize her. He listened. He treated her words as if they were fragile, precious things, leaning in when she spoke and never interrupting. It was a sensory shock to be heard. Darius had spent 3 years drowning her out. Minyi spent every day providing the silence she needed to find her voice again. He began to replace the wardrobe of hiding she had worn, the high collars and baggy sweaters with fabrics that felt like liquid gold against her skin. He brought in tailors and designers, but he didn't stand over them. He sat in a chair across the room, watching her with a gaze that wasn't possessive but protective. When she finally put on a dress that bared her shoulders, exposing the faint, fatting shadows of bruises, Naomi flinched, waiting for the critique. Minyi rose and walked toward her. He didn't touch her. He stopped just outside her personal space, his scent of cedar and expensive tobacco enveloping her like a secondary shield. He looked at the marks on her skin, not with disgust or the accidental pity Darius had shown, but with a searing, lethal recognition of what she had survived. "You are not your scars, Naomi," he said, his voice a low, grounded vibration. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek until she leaned into it. His thumb was rough, calloused from a life of violence, but his touch was as light as a falling leaf. "You are the woman who outran the winter, and I will make sure the world knows it." He began to take her into his world, not as a trophy, but as an equal. He sat her in his office while he took calls that moved millions of dollars and shifted the power of the city's underground. He didn't hide his business from her, he explained it. He showed her the levers of power, how a single word could stop a war or protect a life. One afternoon, he handed her a black titanium card. "This has no limit," he told her. "Go out, buy what makes you feel like yourself. Take the guards or don't, but know that wherever you go, you carry my name. And my name means that no one, not Darius, not the ghosts in your head, can touch you." Naomi looked at the card, then up at the man with the dragon tattoo. The reverence he showed her was terrifying because it required her to believe she was worth it. Darius had taught her that she was a leftover, a thing to be used and discarded. Minyi was teaching her that she was a queen. As she stood on the balcony that night, looking out over the city she had once been terrified to walk through, Naomi realized that her recovery was being built on the foundation of his strength. He was a monster to the world, a man who dealt in blood and shadows, but in the quiet of the penthouse, he was the only person who had ever treated her as if she were sacred. The lessons in power weren't about how to control others, they were about how to control her own life. And as Minyi stepped out beside her, his presence a silent promise of forever, Naomi realized she wasn't just safe. She was becoming dangerous. The sanctuary of the penthouse was absolute, but beyond the reinforced glass, the ghost of Naomi's past was beginning to solidify. Darius Kane had never been a man who accepted a loss. To him, Naomi wasn't a partner who had left, but a high-value asset that had been stolen. His obsession, once masked as love, had curdled into a frantic, debt-fueled desperation. Without Naomi to anchor his delusions of stability, Darius's life had spiraled into the gray markets of the city, racking up debts with people far less patient than the man with the dragon tattoo. He moved through the city like a scavenger, fueled by the bitter memory of his humiliation at the Onyx. He spent his days in dive bars and back alleys, showing Naomi's picture to anyone with a price, his eyes bloodshot and his hands shaking from a cocktail of adrenaline and rage. He didn't just want her back, he needed her back to prove he wasn't the small, broken thing Minyi had made him out to be. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the 3-year winter. He had imposed on her, and without her to dominate, he was nothing. The breakthrough came from a low-level informant in the garment district, a man who had seen a woman matching Naomi's description entering a boutique under the escort of 2 silent, suited guards. The news that she was living in the gilded fortress didn't deter Darius, it sharpened his resolve. He knew he couldn't breach Minyi's penthouse, but he also knew the rhythm of high society. He knew that a king like Minyi couldn't stay in the shadows forever. Darius sat in a stolen car outside a high-end printer's shop, watching through binoculars as a courier emerged with a stack of heavy, cream-colored envelopes. The crest on the wax seal was unmistakable, the annual winter gala. It was the event of the season, a place where the city's underground and its elite rubbed shoulders in a show of strategic peace. It was the perfect stage for a reclamation. Naomi, unaware of the eyes tracking her from the gutters, felt the shift in the air the moment Minyi presented her with the invitation. They were in the library, the scent of old paper and leather providing a grounded contrast to the gravity of the card in her hand. "The world knows you are under my protection," Minyi said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle the sudden fluttering in her stomach. He was leaning against the mahogany desk, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink of the dragon's scales. "But at the gala, they will see you as my equal. It is a declaration, Naomi. It tells every predator in this city that to look at you is to challenge me." Naomi traced the embossed lettering of the invitation. For 3 years, Darius had used social events as a tool for isolation, whispering threats into her ear while she smiled for cameras. Now, the prospect of returning to that world felt like stepping back into a minefield. "What if he's there?" she whispered, the shadow of the past momentarily darkening the bright lights of the penthouse. Minyi moved closer, his presence a wall of heat and iron. He reached out, his fingers grazing the silk of her sleeve. "He is a ghost, Naomi, and ghosts only have the power you give them. My guards will be the air you breathe. My name will be the floor beneath your feet. If he is foolish enough to step into the light of that ballroom, he will find out that the winter he built was nothing compared to the storm I bring." Darius, meanwhile, was finalizing his own invitation. He had traded his last remaining assets, and several promises he couldn't keep, for a valet's uniform and a floor plan of the gala's venue. He didn't need a seat at the table, he only needed a moment in the hallway. He imagined the look on Naomi's face when he stepped out of the shadows, the familiar weight of his hand on her arm, the sensory memory of the fear he had cultivated for 1,000 days. As the night of the gala approached, the tension in the city seemed to tighten like a piano wire. Naomi spent her hours in the gilded fortress, preparing for her debut, unaware that the man who had once offered her a coat was now preparing to burn her world down just to see her in the embers. The shadow of the past was no longer a memory, it was a predator, crouching at the edge of the light, waiting for the king to blink. The annual winter gala was a cathedral of light and glass, a shimmering mirage of safety where the city's elite moved like pieces on a chessboard. Naomi stood at the center of the ballroom, her new gown a masterpiece of midnight silk that draped over her shoulders like liquid armor. Beside her, Minyi was a pillar of absolute authority, his presence commanding a wide berth from even the most powerful men in the room. For hours, she had felt the warmth of his hand on the small of her back, a constant reminder that the winter was over. But the shadow of the past knew how to wait for the flicker of a candle. The breach happened during the transition to the terrace for the midnight toast. Minyi had been pulled away for a mere 30 seconds by an elder of the council, a strategic distraction that Darius had spent weeks planning. In the swirling tide of silk and tuxedos, Naomi found herself momentarily pushed toward the edge of the corridor leading to the private gardens. The air grew cooler, the heavy scent of lilies replacing the expensive perfumes of the ballroom. She felt the shift in the air before she heard him. It was a sensory trigger, a sharp, metallic scent of cheap gin and unwashed desperation that sliced through the luxury of the gala. "Did you really think a new dress would make me forget what you owe me?" The voice was a serrated blade. Naomi froze, her heart stopping in her chest. Before she could turn, a hand, rough, trembling, and terrifyingly familiar, clamped onto her forearm. The grip was frantic, lacking the surgical precision of Minyi's touch. It was the messy, bruising hold of a man who had lost everything and blamed her for the void. "Darius," she breathed, the name tasting like ash. "Don't say my name like you have a right to it," he hissed, jerking her into the shadows of the stone archway. He was wearing a stolen valet's jacket that fit poorly over his agitated frame, his eyes bloodshot and darting. 3 years, Naomi. You don't just walk away from 3 years because some stick-up-his-ass gangster gave you a credit card." "Let me go, Darius. You don't know what you're doing," she said, her voice steadying as she channeled the lessons in power Minyi had taught her. She didn't flinch. She stood her ground, though her pulse was a frantic drum against her ribs. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm taking back what's mine." Darius's face contorted, the mask of love long since rotted away to reveal the raw entitlement beneath. He lunged forward, his fist tangling into her curls with a sickening familiarity. He began to drag her toward the service exit, his movements panicked and clumsy. "We're leaving, now, back to the apartment, back to the way things are supposed to be." The pain in her scalp was a bridge to the past, a sensory link to 1,000 nights of barricaded doors and whispered apologies. As Darius dragged her through the dimly lit hallway, Naomi looked at the servants passing by. They lowered their eyes, terrified of the violence, repeating the same pattern of indifference she had faced at the club. "Stop it, you're hurting me," she cried out, her voice echoing against the cold stone. "Shut up," Darius roared, raising his hand as if to strike her. "You think your new boyfriend is coming. He's busy talking business while I'm taking his prize." He shoved her toward the heavy iron door of the delivery bay, the cold night air rushing in to meet them. For a second, Naomi felt the old, conditioned submission rising like a tide, the urge to simply stop fighting so the pain would end. But then she felt the weight of the silk handkerchief still tucked into her bodice. She remembered the sound of a crystal glass being set down with deliberate intent. She dug her heels into the concrete, her torso twisting with a defiance she hadn't known she possessed. "I am not your prize, Darius, and he isn't just my boyfriend." Darius laughed, a jagged, hollow sound. "He's a man in a suit, Naomi, and I'm the man who owns you." He reached for the door handle, his fingers inches from dragging her back into the permanent winter. But the door didn't open. Instead, the handle turned from the outside with a slow, rhythmic click. The heavy iron door swung inward, not with a bang, but with a silent, heavy grace. Standing in the frame, framed by the moonlight and the shadows of the city, was Kang Minyi. He wasn't breathing hard. He wasn't shouting. He simply stood there, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the hand Darius had buried in Naomi's hair. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Darius froze, his grip on Naomi's hair tightening in a reflex of pure terror. He looked at the man with the dragon tattoo and realized too late that he hadn't breached a gala. He had walked into a tomb. The iron door hissed shut behind Minyi, sealing the three of them into the oppressive, concrete silence of the service corridor. The festive music of the gala became a dull, subterranean thrum, replaced by the jagged, panicked breathing of a man who realized he had hunted a tiger and found a god. Darius didn't let go. His fingers were still buried in Naomi's hair, a pathetic attempt to use her as a shield, but his arm was shaking so violently that Naomi could feel the vibration against her scalp. He looked at Minyi, at the tailored suit, the calm eyes, and the dragon's tail creeping up his throat, and his bravado collapsed into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "Stay back, I'm warning you. I've got people, I've got debts that'll make your life hell," Darius screamed, his voice cracking against the cold walls. Minyi didn't respond with words. He didn't rush forward in a fit of cinematic rage. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out a sleek, obsidian-colored phone. With a casual flick of his thumb, he turned the screen toward Darius. On the display was a grainy, high-definition feed of a dark alleyway, the same alleyway where Darius had parked his stolen car. 3 of Minyi's men, silent and efficient, were systematically stripping the vehicle. One of them held up a burner phone and a small notebook, Darius's entire life of debt and desperation, and tossed them into a portable incinerator. "You don't have people, Darius," Minyi said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that seemed to drain the heat from the room. "You have creditors, and as of 3 minutes ago, I own every single one of your debts. Your life, your breath, even the air in your lungs. It all belongs to me now." Darius's face went ashen. The 3-year winter he had imposed on Naomi was being dismantled by a man who didn't even need to raise his hand to destroy him. He realized that the Gilded Fortress wasn't just a house. It was a global network that had erased his existence before he had even managed to open the service door. "Please," Darius whimpered, his grip finally loosening as his knees hit the concrete. Naomi pulled away, stumbling toward Minyi, who caught her with a single, steadying arm. He didn't look at her yet. His focus remained on the man crawling on the floor. "I just wanted what was mine. I loved her." "You didn't love her," Minyi said, stepping over Darius as if he were a piece of discarded trash. "You possessed her, and in my world there is only one person allowed to claim Naomi Carter." Minyi gestured toward the shadows at the end of the hall. 2 men emerged, ghosts in charcoal suits who moved with a rhythmic, lethal grace. They didn't carry guns. They carried the weight of permanent efficiency. "Take him," Minyi commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "He owes a great deal of money to people who don't like to be kept waiting. Ensure he is delivered to the docks. He's going on a very long, very quiet trip where he will never see the sun or Naomi again." Darius began to scream, a jagged, pathetic sound that was quickly muffled by a heavy hand. He was dragged into the darkness of the delivery bay, his boots scuffing against the concrete until the sound faded into nothing. There was no grand fight, no final monologue. There was only the cold, silent erasure of a man who had mistaken cruelty for power. Minyi finally turned to Naomi. He reached out, his thumb grazing the red mark on her scalp where Darius had held her. His touch was electric, a searing contrast to the chill of the hallway. For the first time that night, the lethal flatness in his eyes flickered, replaced by a fierce, protective heat. "He is gone, Naomi," Minyi whispered. "Not just from this room, from the world. He is a ghost that will never haunt you again." Naomi leaned into his chest, her forehead resting against the silk of his tie. She didn't cry for Darius, and she didn't cry for the 3 years she had lost. She let out a long, shuddering breath, the last of the winter finally leaving her lungs. The wrath of Minyi hadn't been a storm, it had been a surgical strike that left her standing in the light. As Minyi led her back toward the ballroom, his hand resting possessively on her waist, Naomi realized that she wasn't just safe. She was free. The debt was settled, the enemy was erased, and the only person left standing was the king who had decided she was worth the world. The heavy iron door of the service corridor was the last time Naomi ever looked back. When she stepped through it and returned to the warmth of the gala's ballroom, the music didn't just sound like noise anymore. It sounded like a victory march. The 3-year winter hadn't just thawed, it had been vaporized by the man whose hand remained firmly, possessively, anchored to her waist. Minyi didn't lead her away from the crowd. He led her into the very heart of it. He stopped in the center of the floor, right under the massive crystal chandelier that cast fractured light across the faces of the city's most powerful players. The whispers that had followed her all evening, the soft, judgmental murmurs about her scandalous past, died instantly. Minyi turned to face the room, his expression a mask of lethal indifference. "This is Naomi Carter," he said. His voice wasn't a shout, but it carried a weight that made the air feel thick. "She is no longer a guest in my house. She is no longer under my temporary protection." A collective breath was held. Naomi looked up at him, her heart hammering a rhythm of anticipation. Minyi's gaze dropped to hers, the ice in his eyes melting into a dark, burning intensity. "She is the one who stands beside me," he declared, his voice a low vibration that claimed every inch of the room. "And from this moment forward, my name is her name. My debt is her debt, and my wrath is the only thing you will find if you forget that." The room understood what that meant before Naomi's mind could even process the gravity of it. A man across the room, an elder with eyes like flint, raised his glass in a silent, respectful salute. The socialites who had turned their backs at the club now leaned in, their faces masks of practiced admiration. But Minyi wasn't finished. He turned fully toward Naomi, his fingers grazing the ink of the dragon on his neck before he reached into his jacket. He didn't pull out a handkerchief this time. He withdrew a ring, a band of black titanium set with a diamond as dark and deep as the midnight sea. He didn't drop to a knee. A king like Minyi didn't kneel to anyone. Instead, he took her hand, his thumb tracing the scars on her wrist that were now nothing more than memories of a dead man. "I am a monster to this city, Naomi," he whispered, his voice for her ears only. "I deal in shadows and I settle accounts in blood, but to you I will be the wall that never breaks. I will be the fire that keeps the winter away. Will you rule this darkness with me?" Naomi looked at the ring, then up at the man who had seen her at her lowest, and decided she was a queen. She thought of the 1,095 days of fear, the locked doors, and the silence of the crowd. Then she looked at the strength in Minyi's jaw and the safety in his unyielding gaze. She realized that while the world feared him, he was the only sanctuary she had ever known. "I won't just rule it with you, Minyi," she said, her voice clear and resonant, echoing through the silent ballroom. "I'll help you burn anyone who tries to take it." As he slid the ring onto her finger, a cold, heavy weight of absolute belonging settled over her. The proposal wasn't just a promise of marriage, it was a coronation. Minyi pulled her flush against him, his lips brushing her forehead in a gesture of terrifyingly soft reverence. For the first time in 3 years, Naomi wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was standing in a room full of dangerous people, and she wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid because the most dangerous person in the room had chosen her, and she had chosen him back. The leftover daughter of a broken past was gone. In her place stood the queen of the new reign, and beside her king, she knew the world was finally theirs to command.